This meeting is being recorded. Thank you.
Can I make one
Yeah,
announcement?
yes, absolutely. Just kidding.
Sorry. Sorry, I'm just going to make a quick announcement to everybody that's here, but also everybody that is online. For those of you who do not know, we actually have 5 faculty candidates coming through KU and KU Medical Center over the next few weeks. We're very excited about these candidates and this search. This is part of the Lifespan Institute Research Rising initiative that is supporting 2 new faculty hires, and specifically 2 new faculty hires for individuals who have expertise in intellectual developmental disabilities, and more specifically, expertise in cognitive neurosciences or behavioral genetics. So we're excited for these speakers to come through. Several of you, many of you may have invitations for meals or for individual meetings with each of the candidates. But if whether you have an individual meeting or not, we ask that everybody mark it in your calendar the seminars. Each candidate will offer a seminar. The first one will be next Thursday in Lawrence in the Dole Human Development Center in office 1031, but it'll also be available via Zoom. And that will be Dr. Shulamite Green, who will be coming to us from UCLA. Her focus is on sensory development and physiology in autism spectrum disorders. So again, that's going to be next Thursday at 4, and all of you should be receiving calendar invites in the very near future for that particular talk. So please do mark your calendars, and I hope everyone can be there and we can have a huge presence to welcome each of the candidates. So thank you. I'll turn it over to Dr. Jameson.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Mosconi. So I am going to start by introducing Dr. Kourtney Christopher, who is completing her postdoctoral fellowship in our Leadership, Education, and Neurodevelopmental and Related Disabilities program at the University of Kansas Medical Center in the Department of Pediatrics. Dr. Christopher received her doctoral degree from the University of California, Los Angeles, under the mentorship of Dr. Kathy Lord. There, she assisted in the development of the brief observation of symptoms of autism and brief observation of social communication change, the BOSA and the BOSC. Prior to returning to graduate school, Dr. Christopher worked at the Thompson Center for Autism and Neurodevelopmental Disorders at the University of Missouri in Columbia. There, she founded the Global Autism Interactive Network, or GAIN, and brought together a talented group of ADOS trainers to share their proficiency in diagnosing autism. Dr. Christopher's research interests include early identification of autism through phenotyping and creating meaningful assessment models for clinicians and families. I had the pleasure of first meeting Dr. Christopher during her time at the Thompson Center, when she traveled to Kansas City to conduct ADOS training with our KU/KU or CMH providers about 7 or 8 years ago, I think. We remained connected at professional conferences, and then she returned for ADOS trainings through our statewide autism initiative. We're grateful that Dr. Christopher reached out a couple of years ago to pursue additional training through our Lind Fellowship and to work alongside her as a clinician and researcher. During that time, Dr. Christopher has made contributions to clinical and research activities at KUMC, including manuscript preparation, and grant submissions related to the presentation of autism in females and a triage model for autism diagnosis utilizing demographic and pre-assessment data to identify children for an alternative assessment model to reduce wait times. I've enjoyed working alongside Dr. Christopher and look forward to our talk today and future collaborations and contributions to our institution and to the autism field. Welcome, Dr.
All right, thank you, Renee. That's very, very sweet. All right, so I'm going to talk to you about a data-driven model for triaging autism diagnostic assessments here at KU. Let's see here. There we go. Okay, good. So where we'll be going today, kind of give you guys a roadmap of what to expect. First, I'm going to talk a bit about autism, which you all are quite familiar with, but then really talk a lot about these co-occurring conditions. and the impact of those behaviors on our autism assessment measures. Then I want to kind of zoom in and kind of switch gears to think about parent-reported diagnostic assessments, and how could we maybe leverage some of that information to help us triage these children into clinic. So, and then finally, I'll end with future directions and obviously lots of questions, because any good research ends with a bazillion more new questions. Off we go. I love this picture of autism because I think it really represents kind of like holistically what we see when we find a child with autism or an adult with autism. So of course we know there's the two main differences that one might have, but then it sets on these three pillars that I think are some of the most important things that we really need to think about clinically, because they often have the biggest impact on our individuals as they age. They're very highly predictive and related to outcomes. And so we really need to be thinking about these other things as well when we're seeing a patient. But the other really important thing is all of these other co-occurring conditions. And this is what makes autism obviously heterogeneous, but also sometimes hard to diagnose. All right, so I'm sure you all are familiar with this, but there is a nationwide wait list to get a diagnosis of autism. So access to services are hard at the end of the day. And so people often wonder, like, why might this be? Here are some reasons that you see in the literature. There is a lack of trained providers. There's not enough specialty training for some of these highly trained specific programs. There's like right now I'm on the listserv for IDEA as well as the the Division 53, and there's so many postdocs that are open, but there's just not enough candidates to fill some of these positions. And so therefore we do have a lack of some trained providers. When you think about getting a diagnosis of autism, oftentimes it's a multidisciplinary team or an interdisciplinary team. So that big team can also use a lot of resources. And so again, just kind of contributing to the wait list. Unlike, trisomy 21 or Down syndrome, there's not like a blood test that we can get and we can find out, yes, this child, or a big genetic marker that's a one hit that we're going to find autism. So it makes it a little bit difficult to diagnose, as well as that picture that I showed you, all those co-occurring conditions. It makes it hard to pick apart and differentiate autism. And I think the biggest thing to really think about why autism waitlists are happening to us is, 20 years ago, it was 1 in 50, and now it's 1 in 36. And so that alone, if we had none of these other problems, that alone is going to lead to waitlist. Sarah, let's see. Is there anything in the chat that oh no, you can, okay, we're good. Okay, no, you're totally fine.
Probably minimize that.
Oh no, it's okay. I just didn't want to miss something.
That's only going to be us.
Oh,
so whatever.
No, okay. Yeah. Okay. All right. So we know there's a big wait list to get into these clinics, but we've got to be kind of thinking creatively, like how do we get our children in to see us a little bit more efficiently. So the first thing you really need to think about is, what is a good autism diagnostic assessment, right? We don't want to shortchange families. They don't need that. So luckily, there's a bazillion different best practice guidelines telling us how we could diagnose an individual with an autism spectrum disorder. And though there are a lot of different best practice guidelines, what they really boil down to is these two things, right? We just have to have a really good detailed medical and developmental history. So looking for those early presence of these symptoms of autism, in addition to, you should have a direct interaction with the child. And in my field, I use a DSM, but also you could use, the ICD as well. But at the end of the day, it's really these two things. So why is this commonly what our diagnostic process looks like? So we see a family and they have a concern, and maybe their primary care provider. We have them fill out forms. We send them to an expert clinician team, which is wonderful. Sometimes these families do multi-day evaluations, which can be labor intensive. And then they get these tools, which again are amazing tools. These are some of the best practice evidence-based gold standard for diagnosing autism tools. But they take a lot of training and a lot of money, and not everybody probably needs this battery. But yeah, this is kind of what often our families go through. And so just like anything else, I think we need to kind of think creatively. Autism isn't just like a one-size-fits-all program. And so we need to think creatively about how are we going to get to see these kids a little bit more efficiently. So I really like this paper. Dr. DiMartina came and talked to us here at KU, and she talked a lot about this frank presentation of autism in young children. So the kids under 5, that are, you walk in, you see the child and you're like, oh, this is probably one of ours. Perhaps they don't need to go through a multi-day evaluation. But how can we figure out who those kids are before they get into our clinic? Because at that point, they're already going to be with us for the next 4 or 5, 2 days, 4 or 5 hours, 2 days. So something I'm very interested in is leveraging that information that these parents fill out, because they have to fill out so many stinking forms, and like, how can we use these more efficiently to see kids? So how we kind of pivot into that screening idea. So the first thing is I refer them to as EVPs, not evidence-based practices, but emotional behavioral problems. This is an area I'm very interested in. A lot of our kids have them. You see the stats there. Our kids commonly have at least 1 or 2 or more co-occurring conditions. And so it's really important because these oftentimes are more impactful on families than the actual core symptoms of autism. And so this is something that we really need to kind of pay a whole lot of attention to, but it's also interesting to know, like, how do these behaviors impact our autism assessment measures? So again, turning back to the literature, I was interested to see what they did, and could we leverage any of that information to help us? When you look at the literature, what you find is not surprising. So first off, you'll find a reduced specificity, and so meaning you're going to get a lot of false positives in these different autism screeners. So for instance, the SEQ is a social communication questionnaire. It is the algorithm items from the ADI, okay? And it's a shortened screener. It's quite good, but it also has reduced specificity when you have a child that has a lot of behavior problems. The parents may not be attributing, it's not their fault. They just don't attribute the behaviors to the right things. Same thing goes for the SRS, which is Constantino's measure, the child communication checklist. So these are impacted by these behavior problems. When you turn to the CBCL, child behavior checklist, often used in research studies, Vanessa Haspel did a study on that one, and what she found is that if a parent is reporting high emotional behavior problems on the CBCL, then there's an increase of parent-reported social reciprocal abilities, and this is not a good thing. So higher is associated with more autism-like symptoms. And the interesting thing about that study, it was from the Simon Simplex collection. So it's quads. So mom, dad, a child affected with autism, and a child without autism. And oftentimes the unaffected and the affected kid had similar SRS scores, even though one had autism and one didn't. And the SRS really indexes symptoms of autism. So we know that it is impacting the ability of these measures to differentiate. So I think it's also important to think about diagnostic instruments and how do these EVPs affect that. Again, similar findings. When you have higher scores on the CBCL, specifically, we're looking at externalizing behaviors. They're going to impact your specificity. So you're going to get more false positives. You see this on the ADOS as well. So if you guys are ADOSers out there, we call them E codes, so the last other behavior codes. If that total score is at least a 2 or more, your false positive can go up to like 30%. So again, reduce specificity. So we know they're important. And so if we're going to try to think about triaging the kids, like, how do we take these into account before we get them into our clinics? So something I was really interested in is the littles, as I call them. And all that research I just showed you to this point, nobody had looked at the MCHAT and EVPs. And so this is a study that we did when I was at the University of Missouri with some colleagues. It was, it's a portion of a different study, but I refashioned it to this. But what I really wanted to know is, I'm going to first replicate maybe what those other folks found. But then for me, I would like to know, what does this mean clinically? Like, can we use these instruments together before we see these families? So how we went about this is, again, it's a bigger study that we were a part of with Vanderbilt and South Carolina. It's actually a CogNOA study, if you're familiar with that screening tool. It's a technology one. It's a really well phenotyped group, reliable ADOSs. You can see the battery that we did was a best practice battery. The really great thing about this too is it's a clinically referred sample. It's not a research sample. These parents did not know if their kid had autism. I think that's really, really important to think about, because as a parent, when you fill out a form, you know your kid has autism, you potentially could fill it out one way versus when you're coming in and you're unsure. So very important thing about this sample. We had 478 kids across our site. Only 339 had autism. And then as you're moving in on the circles here, we have 290 MChats, but only 214 were positive MChats. Okay. And of the positive MChats, 169 were true positives. So they got it right. The MChat got it. And then 45 were the false positives. And then what you see inside even closer is 80 had significant externalizing behaviors on the CBCL versus the 32 of the kids that were false positives. So what that really shakes out to is this. The kids that had autism had lower reported externalizing behaviors. So this could be like potentially clinically meaningful as when you think about a parent filling out a form, if they don't have significant emotional behavioral problems, but they're screening positive on the MChat, like what does that mean? Is it autism or is it not? And this might show you that potentially could be. So the next progression, obviously, was to run a regression. So we ran a linear regression to find out what was predicting the MChat scores. And it was associated with age, of course, but also externalizing behaviors. And so we extended it out beyond what the MChat is actually used for, above 30 months, because MChat's only 18 to 30 months. Why we did this is because there's not a lot of really good screening tools in that age gap. So, and then what you see to the right then is the difference in the MChat score. So as the MChat scores goes up, so does the clinical impact or the clinical significance of your CBCL. So next, I wanted to look at the sensitivity and specificity and the positive predictive value of the MChat. So how do these EBPs impact our MChat? Probably flying. Okay. So when looking at this, what you see, the first one is just the MChat by itself. And it's pretty good. It's a screener, right? So anything above 70 is a good screener or a good tool in a behavioral phenotyping situation, that is. But we do see lower specificity, which again, associated with screeners. But now if you move to the next one, the 71 and the 44 here, this is when the child did not have emotional behavioral problems reported on the CBCL. And then the next one is showing you when the child has externalizing behaviors reported, what happens to the MChat. So specificity goes way down. So it is impacting this instrument. So then I wanted to take a combination of approach, and luckily I worked with people that just let me keep asking questions and keep attempting to answer them, because again, I want to use this information more meaningfully for families. So when you look at just a positive predictive value, and what that means is basically if the MChat comes out a positive, like our screens get yes, they have autism or they might have autism, what is the likelihood of them actually having it? So MChat alone, 78%. When they have EBPs, it's dropping it to 71. But when they don't have those EBPs, it's 86. So the story here is it's a nice one, right? It's telling us that if the kids don't have EBPs and they have a positive MChat, it's a pretty high likelihood that it is autism. So conclusions of that study that we did is that we see lower EBPs in kids that have kids with autism. In addition, that the likelihood of, let's see here. There we go. Oh, yeah, we have a higher likelihood of having false positives when you have significant EBPs. So we're reducing that specificity. So now, how do we use this in real life?
Kourtney, by the way, you were offered the minute on this.
Oh, me?
Yeah. Renee's
kind of weird.
There, it looks like it's getting real.
Yeah, could you see these slides? Yeah.
You can still see this.
Okay, cool. Okay, so how can we use this to triage some of our kids? So kind of a little history or background of where I came from. They had mentioned that I was at the Thompson Center for quite a number of years, and at that clinic, I was able to do a ton of assessments, did a lot of ADOSs, and we started a new clinic for these kids that are what the Frank presentations were. But how do we get those kids in the clinic was by me reading charts and paperwork, which was exhausting and definitely not time yeah, it was not efficient. But what I would do is I would read through the chart and be like, yep, I think they're a high likelihood, let's send them to this clinic. And it was a physician-led clinic. And then I would do the assessments with the physician. So what we're trying to think about is like how, instead of that, how can we make this work more efficiently? So I had a team of other autism assessment specialists, and we all decided to start filling out intake paperwork. Like, what did you write? What did you write? What did you write for the likelihood, but also what led you to that? Because so we're trying to think about like, how can I pull these, what items are you thinking? What items are you thinking? How do we like make it work together, right? Well, unfortunately, we all think differently, and it didn't work out as one would hope. And so instead, we turned back to our MCHAT paper and thought about how do we leverage those behavioral items. So luckily, too, MU was working with KU at the time, and so we were able to integrate our demographic form into REDCap. So this really is nice because you'll see we're able to streamline this process. So again, we kind of turned back to the data and we looked at those other behavioral items, which is what we were interested in the MCHAT paper. So parents fill out these behavior issues on their demographic form. And so what we just did was we ran a regression to find out what of those behavioral items is predicting the child to have an autism diagnosis. And so these are kind of how the formula was filled out. But I should say the first thing, and it's quite important, is that the kid had to have at least a 3 on the MCHAT. Okay. And then, or if SEQ if they were older. Okay. But then the next step is they would go through our algorithm. And if they had a specific score, then they get like literally directed right into the schedulers that are scheduling case clinic, all behind the scenes, all in REDCap. It's beautiful. Now that's how it's done. At the time we hadn't built it, but now it works. So the next step is just looking more closely at, so that was our regression. That's what it was telling us, I was predicting. So I wanted to look retrospectively at a bunch of patient data to see what is our sensitivity and specificity and positive predictive value. So really we want to focus in on the positive predictive value because we want to really maximize that. So when we get the kids in the clinic, we want to be sure that they actually have autism. So that's your specificity. And then the likelihood of them actually getting the final diagnosis that is autism, it's your positive predictive value. So the numbers are really, really good in the retrospective data, but we knew we were missing something because what we really wanted to put in that case clinic, that quicker clinic, is a minimally verbal kids. Like I don't want to be doing a mod 2 or a mod 3 because those take so much longer to code. There's other differentials on the table. Like I really want the kids that are the more frank autism. So we knew we needed to put language in. But the issue is sometimes parents don't accurately assess their child's language. So you might say, do they have words? And they're like, yes, but actually it's stereotyped or it's scripted. It's not functional words, but you ask the parent if they have functional words. And they're like, what does that even mean? So you kind of had to think about like, what is the best question to get the proxy for language being a module 1 on the ADA. So like minimal speech, right? So what we've ended up pulling, this is work with Summer and Steve Canny, was these 2 items. And if you know the Vineland, these are very close to Vineland, but not word for word. And so those will hone it in, and they're very highly predictive of the child actually getting a module 1. So we built those into the algorithm too. So first off, we piloted the algorithm without the language, and that's what you're seeing here. So more live data, it's still pretty good. But once we were able to add that language, it greatly increased. So that's our case clinic that we had at the University of Missouri. I believe Steve also took this on to Cornell, Steve Canny, and so he's starting to collect data on this algorithm as well now. Yet to publish, though, we need to publish it. But what we know is we can do this. We can translate this into a clinic setting. So before we talk about how to do it at KU, I think it's really important to understand like the lay of the land at KU because making change can be hard. It's just really good to understand the clinic flow and how things work. So at KU, we have, for the kids that I'm specifically interested in this presentation, are under 6 or under 5 in this case. So we have a DEC clinic for the under 5s and then an EEC clinic for our itty bitty little ones. What you'll see is these provider teams make up, sometimes we have 3 providers, sometimes we have 2. And this is really nice because sometimes we get to have medicine and psychology or speech and language pathologists, which is really, really nice as well for our kids that have minimal language. But as you can see, it kind of can take a lot of time, provider time that is. So you're looking to 8 to 12 provider hours to get one child diagnosed. So it can be cumbersome and it can be a lot. And the other thing is we do it all in the same room together too. So a clinician is playing with a child and doing the ADOS or whatever cognitive assessment, and then over here, the other clinician is interviewing the parent. So it can be a bit chaotic at times too with our kiddos, but this is kind of what our clinic flow looks like. So the other really, really important thing is if you're going to make change, we want to make sure that it doesn't affect the patients. Okay, so if we're going to make a new battery or a new quick way to see kids, I got to make sure that the kids get what they need. And oftentimes a kid under 5, our first referral is going to be ABA. And so we have to figure out, like, how can we got to make sure we give them the correct assessments, because unfortunately the way the United States is anyway, is you have to have specific instruments, or what we think we have to have specific instruments to get those services, right? The insurance is dictating who gets ABA. I actually just had a family that had to have a reeval, and her child is like 15 and has had autism since he was 2, but still had to have a reeval to prove he still had autism to continue services. So it is just the way that things are set up right now. So Dr. Swales, Lenny, had this wonderful idea, like, let's look at the insurances that we get. And once we know what insurances we're using at our clinics, let's just call the companies. So that's what we did. So I was able to talk to Blue Cross and Blue Shield. They were lovely. They sent me over a really nice handout of the assessments that they would accept, but also said it's not like mutually exclusive. So we can, tell them, like, if this is a really good measure, we want to include this now. Who knows if they would accept it, but anyways, the lady was quite nice. And so she gave me a really good list. And then we also we had a lot of CanCare Medicaid families that came through. So what we found is about 76% of the kids that we see at KU, we can do this abbreviated battery list. So now we know these kids are going to get services. So that's another kind of conundrum that we have to think about when we build in this algorithm, is what insurance company is this family using? Because we want to make sure that they get access to the care that they need after we diagnose them, right? So now we're thinking about how can we apply this case algorithm and only have a single provider too. So this is kind of a big ask. It's different. But you can save a lot of money and potentially open other clinics and reduce our wait list. So just like we did at Mizzou, first I did, my first look was a retrospective analysis of our data. And this work is done with Lenny and Brenda and Kayla Malouf, who's in the pediatrics department, or the general pediatrics department. And so the really nice thing, as I had said earlier, is that KU and MU talked together quite a bit. And when we were redoing our demographic form at Mizzou, I think when I came up and met you actually for the first time, Renee, we took these questions from you guys and implemented it at Mizzou. And now these are the items that are on our algorithm. So it's so nice because retrospectively, you guys already had this data. So it was easier for me to run. The downside was right now we're not collecting MChat data, and we're also not collecting the specific language questions. So I can tell you what I did instead. So the first numbers you see, the specificity, it's a little bit lower than what we'd like it to be, but it's still, pretty good. Then turning to the language side, when I add in language, it gets better. And so what specifically I did for this one is we asked parents, at what age did your child get single words? And they say a month usually, or sometimes a year. Like 1 year, 2 years old, whatever it may be, or when did they get phrase speech? And if the child has phrase speech, I just dropped them out because that means they might be in a module 2. So that's the proxy I used for this one. So, but you can see it does get better when we can get the kids that don't have language, or much language, that is. So last couple slides, and then we can do some questions. So what we know from all of this work is that EBPs do matter, and the case algorithm works, though I need to refine it a bit more to make it really applicable in this setting. So I didn't mention this before, but I was able to get some funding with some help from Dr. Malouf and Dr. Sally and Dr. Swales. And so to do the initial retrospective analysis, and now we've got some funding for a PEDS quality improvement project. And so Dr. Swales is starting a single provider clinic. What we're doing is applying the algorithm to the existing data that we're collecting, but it doesn't have, again, MChat or the language questions. And I created like a workflow sheet within the EMR. So it sends me the new, any patients that's filled out that patient information form, I get their data. However, the problem with that is I have to hand calculate the likelihood. So I have to clean the data quite a bit to see who are these high likelihood children. So it's not ideal or efficient at this point. The other thing is Dr. Maloof has done a really, really nice job of being a champion within our general pediatrics department. And she is working with those folks to fax us over those items that parents fill out and send us like a risk for autism as you know the pediatrician sees it, which is really great. But again, I get a fax and I have to calculate these numbers. And then once I get the numbers and the kids that I think are high likelihood, then I have to talk to the schedulers and make sure they go into the right clinic. And so it's a bit cumbersome at this point. So potentially not the most efficient, but again, we need to really see if this is working efficiently and effectively, or effectively first, yes, accurately. Our hope is to get 20 patients by the end of the postdoc. And then again, we're Dr. Swales is the clinic director where I work, and so she's trying to build in some of those two specific language items into our patient information form. So hopefully that could even make our triage a little bit better. And we are hoping to collect some quality improvement data because again, if you make changes, you want to make sure that everybody is satisfied with things. So I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. The next steps for what we'd like to do, just applied, or well, it didn't apply, but I submitted a letter of intent for a KL2 to refine this case algorithm. And ideally, I'd really like to build in those autism screeners. So we did that. Remember how we paired the CBCL in addition to the MChat? That idea would be wonderful. If not with the CBCL, that's fine. We could think about just using the behavioral problems that we have on our patient information form. But I think it would be really nice to use that combination approach. And again, parents fill out some of these stinking forms. I wish we could use them more effectively or just use them. Sometimes we look at them for sure, but it would just be really nice to kind of automate things here. I'm hoping to collect this other information, which is quite important, is how do the providers feel about this new clinic, that there's only one of them versus having a team of 2 or 3, because that's a huge change. And thinking about writing reports and making sure that the families are getting all the recommendations they need and follow-up care. So I think we really do need to have this head-to-head comparison between the traditional pathway, how long are you waiting, and how satisfied are you with it? So comparing wait times, but also comparing, are you getting access to the services that you need? And then are the providers also happy as well as the families? So another direction that we really need to think a whole lot about is what about the other kids that are older than 6? Wait lists actually for the younger kids aren't quite as bad. Wait lists for 6 and up are insane. They can be up to a year or 2 years. It's bonkers. It's really hard to get into clinics when you have an older kid, which I get because we want to, you know, all the intervention studies tell us that earlier that we start, the better outcomes they have longitudinally, but at the same time, these families need help as well. So. And this is when co-occurring behaviors really can hit too, when these kids that are older. And so again, families really do need support. So thinking about how to implement that. I also was back at Mizzou, we had a clinic that was just for people that had already been classified by schools. And if the school picked up autism, the diagnostic hit rate was like 95%. The schools got it, then it's autism usually. So it's just another possible, but how do we like mine the data to pull that out, right? Before we see them in the clinic and they tell us, or they, you know, we get the IEP and we're like, oh, crud, like we didn't, you know, we still need to see them. We need to give them a medical diagnosis, but how could we have leveraged that information a little bit more efficiently? Bioinformatics is such a hot thing right now. I am super interested in getting these big data sets. Specifically, KU has a really nice EMR system, and it maybe, you know, my case algorithm items are great, but potentially there might be other better stuff in there that's already being collected. So how could we maybe flag kids that way? I think it would be a really interesting thing to look into. And yeah, the integration is huge. Like, so we have these red flag items. How do we get them to the clinics that they need to go to instead of me emailing the schedulers and hand calculating things? Like, how do we make this real life and actually applicable? All right. Oh, and another thing that the missing kids. I think this is really important because right now what we're looking at is English speaking. And I know Dr. Maloof does a number of work with some refugee populations. And so we got to make sure we take some of these things into account because sometimes our kids that are not native English speakers, they get missed. I know on screening measures because that was my dissertation was on that, but also I think it's something that we really need to think about like holistically as a field too. So amazing collaborators here at KU and some from my previous institutions. These are our funding agencies to conduct some of this work here on Mizzou or at KU on Mizzou. And those are our favors. So and that's what I got. All right, any questions?
I don't know where the microphones are in this room, so I'm just going to come up here and make sure everybody can hear me. So first of all, please, Cassie already said it, please put questions in the chat, or also, are we able to have people unmute and ask questions? Great, we should be able to hear you, so please feel free to raise your virtual hand, unmute, and ask away. I'll just start though, because I had a bunch of questions. First of all, I just want to say that was fantastic. It's a really interesting approach. This is really, like, in my opinion, high impact work as someone who used to be a clinician. But this is really needed. One thing that occurs to me though is, and you kind of alluded to it at the end in terms of integrating with bioinformatics expertise. And so I wondered if you had thought through whether this could be actually adapted or whether you could collaborate with people that are actually doing EHR work and doing different machine learning strategies so that you could continue to update algorithms, not only for these younger or more frank cases, to put it in like the Philadelphia terms or whatever, but also, as you brought up, the older kids or the kids that would be module 2, module 3, maybe there's something that could actually help with some sort of triaging system. In that regard, using data as opposed to, you know, always reading through all the measures kind of thing, but you can track it quickly.
I know. I think that would be incredible and a great direction to go to. I was trying to think what are some of the ideas. I think the bioinformatics would be just a great opportunity that we could leverage here at KU. I was trying to think what exactly I would want to do with that.
So yeah, I'm saying, and please, if you could help me just kind of translate to the audience when I ask questions.
Sure. Yeah.
But yeah, no, I'm just thinking that, like, if they're completing forms, right, like you have that, whether you could, whether people who have expertise in developing algorithms that themselves learn over time could extract that information and give you some sort of more categorical outcome, not the diagnosis per se, but not necessarily, but more, this is someone who's going to be needs to go to this clinic first, or this clinic, or their emergent case. You know,
I think that would be great too, because I think the thing about autism too is it's always evolving and changing in the way that we think about it. So a big data like an AI would be a really dynamic way to think about.
You also think about, like, you're cutting off like by age, or module, language, but there may be like gradients where there's different collection points that aren't as arbitrary as chronological age, developmental age. The data can be combined to get that. So
no, I love that idea. That would be so powerful. And there's little cut points. That would be so cool.
Here that I would love to hook you up with to think about things like that. And it'd be really interesting.
Oh, cool. I would love that. That'd be very cool. Yes.
Okay. So I agree with Matt, as I think there's lots of opportunity to think about all the data we already collect, right? And how we can just use that to streamline autism evaluation. I want to say how much I appreciate your presentation, Kourtney, around translation from clinical, research to clinical practice and back and forth, because I think that some of the gaps are around people not being able to do that. And so, like, it's informing, like kind of like practical applications for families. And I think what Dr. Mosconi said is a good example of how we can leverage those things to then put it into practice and then have outcomes that we can examine. But so I have to ask my question.
The girls.
Okay. So, and this is something we talked about for some next steps, and with some of the data that we have that we've already looked at around gender differences in terms of referral and diagnosis, and some of the gender differences in those measures that you talked about. So So yeah, did you look at any of those things? And if not,
Yeah,
what would be,
we could.
based on our work together too, what would be some of the things that you do for next steps?
Yeah, I know we didn't do,
And Courtney, if you could just real quickly summarize what
Yeah.
Renee is asking.
Oh, yeah.
Make sure there's a.
yeah, sure. So Renee, Dr. Jamison was talking about thinking about other ways that we could look at the data and see if specifically gender had an impact on the algorithm. And if we were thinking, because what I think she may be getting at is we often miss those young girls, and potentially like what are maybe, is this algorithm as good for girls as for boys? And we didn't separate the data by that, and why I didn't run that in the regression either. So that's a really good question, and that would be a really interesting next step, because I would love to know more about, I was trying to think the items that are on our algorithm and if our girls would be like showing them. But yeah, that's a great next step and something to think about as our girls. We tend to miss those. Yeah. Great question. Anybody else or anything? Yeah.
This is great. I'm thinking a lot to partially as the child of a pediatrician about like how much of the role of the pediatrician in doing the MCHAT and how a lot of this is based on that measure. And also thinking about how much, at least I've seen at conferences, that it's been an increasing topic of how to increase pediatrician and provider comfort with assessing for these kinds of features. And I'm sort of wondering, like, from your perspective, like, what are some ways that, in order to achieve approaches like this, we have to start with an assessment that is thorough and with a provider that feels comfortable and really knows what they're looking for. And so I'm wondering, like, I guess it's bottom up, but like what your thoughts are about like what the state of like primary care provider comfort and assessment is, and if there are ways that we can branch out to secondary question, but ways we branch out beyond the MCHAT, things like the ages and stages questionnaires, and like inching this to younger ages as well, so that we can get earlier in our flagging.
Yeah, this is a great question. So the first one is the PCP's comfortability with some of these assessments. And then you'll remind me of the second one because I probably will figure it by then. So PCPs, I think the challenge with PCPs is oftentimes they don't have time to do all the assessments that our kids need to get access to those services. And then sometimes our PCPs, if they know the child has autism, they don't take those patients on actually, just because they're afraid of caring for a child with autism for some reason, because it's unfortunately not usually a part of their training. So I get that. But also I think it's a real thing to harness. This is why I really appreciate with Kayla Malouf, who's in general pediatrics, and she's working with us trying to figure out how do we get these kids in more effectively. Ages and stages is a really great idea to also think about how we could maybe use ages and stages data because that should already be in the EMR actually. And so if there's items within that we could think about pulling. So I like that idea too. But training, I think that KU's done a pretty nice job of having sometimes our residents, or not even just residents, just in the M1, whatever, M2s and M3s, they get to cycle through our clinic. So maybe they get to see one kid with autism get diagnosed, which is really, really helpful. But unfortunately, I don't think that that's the case in a lot of medical universities. So yeah, I think it's a hard question to answer, but it's a really good. It's a hard problem, but something that really should be addressed for sure. Because 1 in 36, they're going to come across it, right? So how do we get that built into their training programs? Good ask. And then what was the other one?
They just like how can we incorporate other measures that
are you using?
Done in a general pediatrics office setting, or
and they're supposed to do the MCHAT right at 18 months.
24, right?
Yeah, that's what it's recommended. And they might do it, but maybe it doesn't make it into our records or something. And they really should do the follow-up interview, but that sometimes isn't feasible either. And so I think the thing too is that those this visits are quite short. And so it makes it really hard for them to make that diagnosis. Sometimes some models that I've worked with too is the echo autism.
Yeah.
Okay, so we did that with the PCPs back when I was at Mizzou, and then we designed one for community provider psychologists and teaching them the ADOS and the ADI, and so pushing out like psychologists in the community, and like I had overlapping circles, so I'd have an MD and then I'd have a psychologist because there's not very many of them circling the MD, so then the MD could refer there instead of referring to the Thompson Center because the wait list to get in the TC was so stinking long. And then we had this ongoing case consultation with the psychologist to help them. It's de-identified, it's the echo model. But anyways, the only issue that with the study that I did, I feel like, is that I didn't ever get to do a full validation of it. So I think the providers are good, but I didn't ever get to bring them in and do a blinded assessment. So, but I know that echo is quite popular and does some really good work.
I have one more question.
Of course.
So this is just like I guess a broader, question about what you had this thought.
Uh-oh.
How are you thinking about this, scaling this out? So like you're doing the case, like 20 people during postdoc.
Yep.
Which is awesome. I see people on the Zoom call from other institutions.
Yeah.
And so I'm just thinking about like, this seems like a highly scalable model. And so I don't know whether you consider how that may go or what would be the critical pieces.
Yeah, and collaboration with that
place, including talking to people that are here on Zoom.
Yeah. Absolutely. I for sure Steve Canny is implemented at Cornell at CADB right now. The TC is ongoing, so they're still running it and they're still feeding patients right now. So we'll have at least 3 data sites or data sets that we could look at. But yeah, I would absolutely love to scale it and share it. It's not like, I love more kids to get seen efficiently, and there's plenty of autism to go around, so
Right.
like let's get these kids in and get them home. So
Yeah, I'm just wondering if it could be, I mean, if Mercy could be involved and how parallel their systems are to ours to start that scaling process. But,
do they use REDCap?
Well, no, but like they are very interested. I think there's some crossover between our patient information, like the question forms.
Mhm.
When we met with you all from the Thompson Center.
Yeah.
And that was a kind of a collaboration we were working on. So.
Oh yeah, was Cy Nadler there?
Yeah, Cy's on there or not, but yeah, definitely. I think it's a great opportunity for multi-site and
there's Cy, I see him.
there he is. Yeah.
Is he on there?
You can- I know you can't. do
Hi,
that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, there he is. Oh, there he is. Hey, sorry.
So Cy, we just signed you up for a project.
Pulled you out.
Yeah.
I heard about 30%
He
of
loves
it.
AMChat.
Let's do it. Yeah. Well,
Oh, wait.
yeah, something like that. Love to improve access. So we'll,
Yeah, it's
we'll talk.
maybe not used.
Yeah.
Effectively in your data as you'd like it.
Unless we have.
Yeah, sorry about that. So I think we are having technology issues in terms of hearing you, but maybe I can double back and connect you all to carry this conversation. So yeah, you had comments, you can also put it in the chat, but either way.
Okay.
I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but I can see a potential partnership.
Yeah.
Courtney, I was going to add, some questions around, kind of those other variables that often aren't considered, like the impact of the cost associated with
It's a great.
doing the autism evaluation, not even just at initial diagnosis, but later in research studies, confirmation.
Yeah.
When you're talking about, I mean, as a clinician, sometimes it's really clear that a child has autism.
Yeah.
And so, I think that could be a variable,
Mhm.
To collect information
Yeah.
on.
I think we may have wrote that in the KL, the LOI maybe.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, just a cost, I need to know better how to conduct really good cost analysis of like models and things like that. But yeah, absolutely. And provider time and families burden, things like that. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about insurance and like what's required, but on the other level, it's like being included in a research study
Mhm.
and the amount of cost that goes into some of those diagnostic or reconfirmation of diagnosis could be.
That would be nice. Yeah, I also wonder a lot about, yeah, because to redo ADOSs kind of seems sometimes silly. So in research studies, the BOSA is pretty dang good. And so I want to do more work with BOSA to see, I have a couple data sets that I have access to from UCLA, and I want to look at, there's an initial validation paper that came out that showed it's pretty sensitive and specific, but now I'd really like to look at another data set that's not just us from UCLA and CAD-B data. I would like to look at more like widespread, even just plain people that are just clinically trained, not research reliable, like how good is a BOSA in real life? So maybe that could be something you could compare diagnosis with for a study instead of doing an ADOS. And do you have to be trained on the ADOS to give the BOSA and code it accurately? I don't know. It's a question that's just not been asked. So
We'd asked.
well, but nobody's answered it like data wise. Yeah, it's definitely absolutely. Yeah. I think that's when Kathy is really interested in answering too. Is like, yeah.
And I think your point, that is good about like what data is out there that we can already like look at. I think that cost perspective. So what's out there in terms of like characteristics that can be part of this triage model, or kind of
I
like
love the ages
algorithms.
and stages.
What's out there already too around kids that, or people that are included in research studies, their original data, and then confirmation and the cost associated with that.
Yeah, could be a sign. Yeah.
It's out there.
Yeah, definitely.
So with that, we're about at the hour. So I just want to thank you again, Kourtney. Obviously, you generated a lot of excitement around this idea, and I think there's just a lot of different directions you can go with it. And so I'm excited to see where that goes. So thank you again for the wonderful talk.
Of course.